So I'm sure that most of you are already aware of the fact that inequality is a thing. And most of you, I would guess, probably think that there's too much of it. But people have some very strong disagreements about what, if anything, we should do about it. And this is what we're going to talk about today. Now, some of what I say in this video will not come as any kind of surprise to you, I know. But what I want to do today is to take a look at the issue of inequality from a pure economics perspective. First, we're going to try to understand the effects of inequality, both the good and the bad. Then we'll take a look at what the research says about it. And finally, we're going to talk a little about the challenges involved in addressing the issue. Before we start, just note that there are two main kinds of economic inequality. There's inequality of incomes, or the amount of money that someone earns in a year, and inequality of wealth, or the amount that someone owns. Right? These are different, and they have different implications, and they require slightly different discussions. So I'm just going to focus on one today, income inequality, which is the one that's usually the most important for an economist. Also, I'll preface this by saying that this topic can get very deep and complex and lead in many different directions, so I'm going to try to keep it as focused as possible, which should leave a lot of space for further questions and topics in the future. Now let's get started. First, it's important to say that most economists generally agree that some level of income inequality is actually a good thing. One of the assumptions that economists often make is that people are rationally self-interested. What that means is that people usually will do what they can to get more for themselves, and they're generally pretty good at figuring out the best ways to do that. Of course, this isn't always the case, and modern economists are actually being forced to reconsider the logic behind this assumption. But it still works fairly well as a way to understand the general broad brushstrokes of economics. For example, if you're going to spend a bunch of money to buy a house, you're probably going to try to get one in a good neighborhood with good schools for your kids, and you're going to try to get the lowest price possible. You know, if you qualify for some tax deduction and you know about it, you'll probably try to take that deduction. In common cases like this, people are generally, broadly speaking, self-interested. Because of this, a system where inequality is possible creates incentives for innovation and entrepreneurship. In other words, people will try to find better ways to make better products and to improve themselves and their own capabilities, because it will get them more money. This actually drives progress because improvements in technology and processes, as well as improvements in the quality of the labor force, increases productivity, which improves the overall prosperity of society. Sure, there will always be the intelligent and curious few that will invent and improve themselves no matter what, but the financial incentives that come along with some inequality will cause more people to try, or invest in other people who will try, which leads to more progress faster. This is the essence of the classical libertarian style argument for allowing the market to freely determine inequality. We need incentives to make people work harder. And there's honestly some general significant truth to this. Although, there are some really big wrenches we can throw into the libertarian logic, which I'd love to talk about in a future video. But for now, let's keep moving. Like so many things in life, and especially in economics, inequality is a balancing act. While some inequality creates incentives, too much of it can actually lead to a situation with too little social mobility, which can actually reduce incentives when people start to believe that it's too hard, if not impossible, to improve their situation. Consider that, mathematically speaking, the most unequal society possible is one in which a single person owns everything. In this case, everybody else is perfectly equal to one another. But unless they can somehow become that one person, there's no way for them to improve their life. So really, what incentives do they actually have to try? This is, of course, an extreme example, but the point is that somewhere along the line between perfect equality and perfect inequality, incentives will start to fall. High inequality can also lead to social tensions and political unrest, as the people on the lower end of the spectrum become more and more desperate. These things are invariably bad for economies because they increase uncertainty in the market, which increases risk. Higher risk means less investment, which can lead to slower, if not negative growth. Finally, and most importantly for our purposes in this video, high inequality can lead to a decline in aggregate demand, or the total amount of stuff the entire economy wants to buy. This is due to a phenomenon that we call diminishing marginal utility. Now that's just a fancy way of saying that as your income increases, each additional dollar that you earn is worth less to you than the previous dollar. So imagine that you have $100 in your bank account and I offer you 10, right? To you, that $10 is an extra meal. It's a couple more gallons of gas. Gets you closer to your next rent payment. Basically, it's important. But if you have $100,000 and I offer you 10, you won't notice the difference. Honestly, at that point, what are you going to buy with that $10 that you wouldn't have already bought anyway? You'll probably just save it. The data does show that people with more money spend more money, true enough, but it also shows that they spend a lower percentage of their money and put a higher percentage into savings. Now, saving money is useful for the economy as well, because it reduces interest rates, which increases investment. But, like most things in economics, again, it has to be balanced with other considerations. Like, perhaps interest rates are already low enough, and what we really need is more consumption. So which is more important to us right now? Do we need more inequality and thus more savings, or do we need less inequality and thus more consumption? Well, no matter what country you live in, nobody argues that we need more inequality. There's a good reason for this, and that's that nobody thinks that we need more inequality. The disagreement generally is between people who think that we have a good amount of inequality and people who think that we have too much. So who is right? Ultimately, most research agrees that, especially in the developed countries of the world, but also in many of the developing countries, inequality is just too high. This means that reducing inequality will likely increase consumption more than it will decrease investment, thus improving economic performance overall. And this is, by the way, according to research published by such organizations as the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, Standard & Poor's, as well as numerous independent academic researchers. So the side of inequality is too high pretty clearly dominates the global field of experts, and probably most of the people in the world too, honestly. But the other side includes many of the world's wealthiest people who have a disproportionate impact and influence on politics and policy, which is probably what makes it a little bit difficult to do things to address the issue. But this is not meant to be a political discussion, so let's move on to talking about what the solutions might look like. Unfortunately, designing policy to address a specific issue is rarely a simple matter. I mean, there are a lot of tools, but they all have potential downsides. A higher minimum wage can help, but it can also create a drag on employment if it gets too high. A progressive tax system is a very powerful tool, but it can create perverse incentives if it isn't designed very carefully. Social welfare programs that redistribute income can help a lot too, but again, they can create undesired incentives if they aren't created, planned, and implemented with a lot of care and precision. I must emphasize again that managing an economy is a very complex balancing act. It requires a lot of careful consideration and thought for everything in terms of its costs and benefits, because it seems usually like everything can affect everything else, and the nature of those connections isn't always clear. So we have to be very careful in thinking about how what we are doing will affect the rest of the system. With the minimum wage, for instance, it's difficult for us to know exactly at what point it starts to create a significant drag on employment that will overpower its positive effects. There is a strong moral argument to be made for the idea of a living wage, where someone who works a full-time job should earn enough money to be able to pay for all of their legitimate needs. Now, exactly what those needs are is a much larger debate, and the irregular nature of some of them, such as healthcare, implies that perhaps meeting those needs will require a more complicated solution than simply raising the minimum wage. Importantly, we should never forget that it's always possible to mitigate the negative effects of a policy if we think that that policy is important enough to use anyway. For instance, any drag on employment and small business growth that may result from an increase in the minimum wage could be counteracted with complementary policies such as subsidies and tax benefits for small businesses, or reduction and elimination of sales and value-added taxes, which have a negative impact on consumer demand. Progressive taxation is an important part of reducing income inequality. The easiest way to do this is to use progressive marginal income tax rates. Contrary to what some people may tell you, a higher marginal tax rate on the wealthy has never caused anyone to work less, and it's unlikely that it ever would. After all, when you already earn $1 million, whether you're going to earn an extra $300,000 versus $400,000 doesn't really make much of a difference in your decision matrix. What they don't tell you is that insofar as it decreases incentives for high earners, it also increases the cost of giving high earners another $1 million to take home, because more of that has to be then paid in taxes. This can actually increase the incentives for businesses to spend their extra profits on things like growing and improving themselves, or even in increasing the salaries of lower wage earners. Of course, you don't want to go as high as a 100% marginal tax rate, because you don't want to remove all incentives for productivity and entrepreneurship, but there's a lot of room to go before you hit that limit. Another option is to tax luxury goods, but you have to be careful not to tax the kinds of goods that poor people are likely to take advantage of. This would make it too similar to other kinds of regressive taxes like sales taxes and value-added taxes. Now, these are essentially just taxes on consumption, which doesn't sound so bad at first. After all, rich people do consume more. Now, these taxes are generally politically popular because they're easy to implement and they can generate a lot of tax revenue with a tax rate that seems low. But that's really just kind of a superficial appearance. Remember what we said before, rich people spend more, but poor people spend a higher percentage of what they get. This means that a tax on consumption is effectively a higher tax rate on the incomes of the poor people, and thus they should be avoided generally in the interest of reducing income inequality. Social welfare programs and other kinds of transfers to the poor can get a little bit tricky. Ideally, we would want to live in a world where these kinds of policies are not necessary, but unfortunately, life and economies are fickle things. They shift and they change, and even when those changes are positive overall, they can leave some people in a worse position, with things like sudden unemployment or high unexpected costs. People make a lot of moral arguments in favor of protecting these kinds of individuals, but there's a lot of really good economic arguments for it as well, which we can talk about in detail in the future. Just understand for now that protecting them is generally a good thing because it promotes the overall stability of the economy. But when designing programs to do that, you have to be careful to provide the necessary assistance without introducing undesired incentives. The classic right-wing argument here is that if you give people too much assistance, then they won't want to work. Now, this is a legitimate point in the extremes, but the argument is often used very overzealously. In fact, there's a lot of research which suggests that providing some assistance to poor people can actually make them more likely to work by supporting their ability to work and by reducing the amount of time that they need to spend on other things. A better, more useful example would be the difference between, say, providing housing subsidies directly to tenants versus subsidizing or mandating the construction of additional lower income housing. Both will help poor people pay their rent, but the first might just provide space for rents to rise even further, while the second could actually control those costs by ensuring a higher supply of the thing that is needed. Now, to be clear, I do not intend this example to be a comprehensive analysis of the issue of how to address housing costs. Also, I warn you not to generalize any patterns you might see in it. Every specific issue has its own specific matrix of influences and effects that can really only be deciphered through careful study of data. The point that I want to make here is that the best way to resolve an issue is not always the one that seems to be most direct. Now, we could go on and on for days about different ways that we could try to reduce income inequality, but the points that I want to make with this video are simple. The economic research is generally in agreement that income inequality is too high, but the issue is complicated and the simple solutions are not always the best. It is definitely important to control inequality, but we have to be very careful while doing it, and we shouldn't give up. It's definitely, absolutely possible to reduce income inequality while increasing economic productivity and efficiency at the same time. So the moral of the story here is that there is always, always, always room to improve. Hey, thanks for listening. I realize that this video topic wasn't extremely specific and some of the conclusions may seem a little obvious, but what I'm trying to do is build a foundation for a broad range of future discussions. So please, if there's anything here that I talked about that you want to know more about, or really anything that you want to know more about, just let me know down in the comments. I hope to see you again next time.